This is Lindsay Upton the Quilt Quine, and we're going to be trying to set this design of a whole cloth quilt onto a practice quilt. This has been designed by Denise Jones for the Bernina USA We Also blog, and there you will find all of the sizes that you need. You can either piece this quilt or draw it onto a piece of calico, which is what I have done. I have left myself a generous border outside of the quilt just to keep things nice and tidy. And I have basted the whole quilt using a colourful thread just to stop the borders from shifting as I stitch. So let's get started. The first thing that I will do is save a copy. This is a nice tidy version of the original, but as we work, things are going to move and get a little bit muddled, so I'm going to work from a copy. File, save project. There is the original, and I'm going to save a copy of it. Copy, save. Okay, so now my original is safe in case everything goes wrong and I muck it up. Righto. The first thing I want to do is quilt as much as I can within my safe area. So as you can see, the outer leafy border is all connected at the moment. So the first thing to do is unconnect it or disconnect it so that I can fit as much as I can in my safe area. So I shall go to disconnect. And now I can see that I've got the corners and the top border separate. What I really want to do is check that my start stops are in the right place. So I'm actually going to just swap this one. And that one as well. And that one as well. Now I hope to be able to connect them up in order. So I'll click the first top left corner, and I will go to connect, and I will attach them like that. So there we are. I have the top corners and the border all connected together. I'll give that a green check. Now, what I need to do is place some markers on the quilt using the sew head to check that that actually fits in the area that it's supposed to go in on the quilt. So I shall go to the pin to set down some markers. Then I need to go to my sew head and put them down on the quilt. I'm going to take the sew head and put it within the 1/2 inch line that I have marked inside the entire quilt area. That's so that when I put the binding on, my design does not disappear under the binding. So using my laser light, I'm just placing some markers on the quilt. Now remember that we're using fabric, not wood or paper, so there will be some shifting. I'm placing a rectangular box where that top border should go. Once I have set the markers on the quilt, I'm just going to connect them. So by clicking them in a clockwise direction, I shall see where this border needs to go. And I'll give that a green check. And as you can see, the red section of border is outside of where the actual border on the quilt is. So I should just be able to drag that down. I can go into an actual sized view and check that it fits where it should go. So I can look up and down, and I can scroll over to the side to see that it fits. And I might just move it down a little, then come out into full-sized view and check that I'm happy with that. And it looks good. So what I'm going to do is go to my sew options, and I usually DQ all and simply select the piece that I want to stitch, which is that bit there. And if I'm happy with the placement, I'll give it a green check. I'm just going to increase my stitching speed a little bit. Go to play, ask Qmatic to go to the start point. Qmatic is taking itself to the start point. I have to go over and lift up the bobbin thread, and now it's stitching out the top border. Okay, so Qmatic has nicely stitched that first top border within the area that it's allowed to go on the quilt. So I'm very happy with that. The next thing that we need to do is see what else we can stitch within this safe area. So it's probably this springy border. So let's click it. And at the moment, the entire thing is connected. So what we need to do is disconnect it. That's still connected, and that whole side is connected. So we need to disconnect that as well. And this side as well. And now we'll be able to connect some of the vertical border, the corners, and all of the top border. So we need to do that. And we may need to swap some of the start points just so that it joins up nicely. We'll have a look. So I'm going to click this one because that's going to fit. And I'm going to see if I can attach it to the rest with a connect and attach. And all of that fits within the safe area. So I'll give it a green check. Next, I'm going to have to go and place some markers so that I can make sure that those springs are fitting within the place on the quilt that they should go. So I'll go back into markers and I will clear the ones that I used before. Now I'm going to take the sew head and I'm going to mark out where it's allowed to go on the quilt. I need to know the width of the border, where the border goes, and then place some markers along it. Remember, it's not paper, it's fabric, so there will be a little bit of movement. There are the markers on screen. I'm going to connect them up, clicking them in an anti-clockwise direction. And that's where they all should be. And you can see that the quilt is not totally straight, even though I've drawn it accurately and I have basted it. Okay, so the springs are reasonably within where they should go. I need to go and have a closer look, so I shall zoom in. I can zoom in a couple of times, or I can go to actual size view. Now it's red, so I'm just going to drag it slightly so that it looks evenly distributed. And I can just run my eye along and check that nothing is going to cross over the line that indicates where the border is on the quilt. Looks quite good. I'll just move it a tiny bit. When I'm happy, I'm going to accept that that's where it's going. I'm going to go to sew options, DQ all, and select the part that I want to sew. Green check, play, and I'm going to ask Qmatic to take itself to the start point. Okay, sewing is complete. The springy border top has been placed on the correct part of the quilt within the borders. It hasn't encroached anywhere that it shouldn't be. So that's good. Next, we're going to see how much of this shell border we can fit in while we've got this part of the safe area. So let's click it and have a look. Everything's connected at the moment, so we need to disconnect it. And we need to disconnect it again. Right, so there's that corner. Quite close to the safe area, so it might not quite fit in. That will definitely fit. That will not fit because it does definitely cross over. So let's see if any of the leafy border might fit. While we're at it, we'll have to disconnect it. That bit should fit. Let's disconnect that and have a look. And that bit might fit. So I think we'll try and do these two vertical leafy sections. And then we will have to advance the quilt just a little bit. Right, let's try this. So that is the next bit of the leafy border that we need to do. First of all, we're going to have to take the sew head over to the last bit that was stitched on the corner. I've taken my sew head over to the last bit that was stitched on this corner, and the crosshairs are indicating exactly where those last stitches were placed. So I'm going to go into an actual size view so that I can get a closer look. So remember, I said the crosshairs are showing the last stitched point. So I'm going to move this red section down, and I'm going to put the tail of this red section bang onto the crosshairs. On screen, it looks like I should go here, but on the quilt, which is where the crosshairs are, this is the exact point. So I shall put it there and come out into a full view. Now, something to be aware of when we're adding vertical borders is that, generally speaking, you can either exactly match up the joining point, or you can get your placement right. You can't always have both. Right, so let's just lay down some markers and see what happens. So we'll go into markers, clear the ones we had before, and I want to know if this red section fits nicely within the width of the border. So I'm going to take my sew head and place down some markers. Then I'm going to connect them up. Green tick. So the blue box is showing where the width of that border is. If I want a closer look, I might go to actual size. I haven't moved the red section at all. Does it fit? Yes, it does. There is a bigger gap on this side than this side. However, I do want it to match the last stitch line if possible, so I shall go with that. Coming out into full view again, I'm going to accept that that's pretty good. I'm going to DQ all, select that section there, and I shall stitch it. Green check, play, start point. That section of the right hand vertical leaf border has been stitched. So now I have moved my sew head and lined up the laser pointer or the needle with the last stitches of the leafy corner. So the crosshairs are showing exactly where those last stitches were placed. So this is the piece of border that I need to line up, this red piece. So I shall go into actual sized view. So I'm going to slide this red section and put its tail right on those crosshairs there. And I need to come out into full view to see if that still fits within the safe area, which it does. And I should really place some markers to see that it fits across the width of the border where it's supposed to go. So we'll just do that. I'll connect those markers up. They look a little bit wonky. Have a closer look in actual size. Very close to the right hand border. What I might do is just take my sew head back to this end point and check that I placed that as accurately as I could. So the crosshairs are now absolutely where those last stitches were. So I'll just move this a tiny bit up there. So I want them, I want that red design to pick up where the other corner finished. Let's go out into full view. So I could resize this to fit it in better, but because I have allowed a generous ½ inch between the edge of the quilt and where the design is allowed to go, I think I will accept that as being okay. So I shall go to my sew options, DQ all, and select the part that I want to be sewn next, which is that piece. Green check, play, start. That section has been stitched out, and I have to say that the tails of the corner and the next vertical piece line up exactly, so that's really cool. I decided that the shell border is what needs to happen next, but it was rather close to the safe area, so I'm going to have to advance the quilt. Not as much as I would do if I was doing an overall design, just a little bit, because I want to fit in the corners, top border next. So I'm just going to advance it a bit. I have advanced the quilt just by a few inches, so now I'm going to have to tell Qmatic exactly where it is. So we'll go to realign the safe area and we will choose the snap to point option. Then I'm going to have to take the sew head across to an obvious place in the design that I can line up on the quilt and match up on the screen. I've decided that I'm going to use the corner of the spring border as a reference point. So I've taken my sew head over and placed it over there. Qmatic doesn't know where it is at the moment because we haven't actually told it. So ignore where the crosshairs are on screen. I'm going to roughly click my mouse in the corner of the spring border. Then I'm going to go to the actual sized view and check for accuracy. And you can see it wasn't quite accurate by where I guessed, so it's there. I'll come out into full sized view again. Then I will click the green tick. And now the safe area has moved just a few inches down, but it will give me scope to do this part of the shell border. Right, so we want to do the corner, the long section, and the other corner. So let's just see about attaching them. So the top left corner is red. Let's go to connect, attach, click that bit and that bit. So we're going to get this bit sewn next. Green check. I will place some markers to check that they're going to fit accurately in the border of the quilt. So we'll go to the pin or the markers, we'll clear the ones we had before, and we'll use the sew head to set down some new ones. I'm going to connect those up so that I can get a reference box. Now that is where they need to go. So let's click green. And then let's have a closer look. So we'll zoom in a couple of times to see how that fits. Right, now you should be able to see that the issue here is that it goes over the border there. So let's just see if we can pull it down a bit. It does now fit in there. That part of the border is within that marker, so that's okay. That one is just within that one, so that's okay. So rather than get myself in a muddle with resizing, I shall decide that that's pretty good. So I'm going to go into my sew options, and DQ absolutely everything else, DQ all, and select that part of the shell border. Green is good. Play at the start point. So Qmatic has finished stitching out the top shell border. Now would be a good time to check the bobbin area for fluff and to check that I've still got plenty of thread. Having stitched all of the top borders, we need to start working our way down the sides. So I've advanced the quilt a bit more. We need to go into realign and snap to point and tell Qmatic where it is going to be going next. So I've taken my sew head onto the last stitched point of the vertical leafy border. Ignore where it is on the screen. It doesn't know at the moment. I think it's around about here. So I shall just click roughly with my mouse. Then I'll go into actual sized view to check for accuracy. So I'm not far out and we have a new safe area. Okay, so the next piece of leafy border to do is this one. So the sew head is sitting right above the last stitched line, or the last stitched point of this piece of border. So I need to go into actual size view and check that the red section is going to line up. Actual size. So remember, we're using the crosshairs now as the reference point. So that part of the red leafy section has to come down and sit right over those crosshairs. Full view. Okay. Now to check that it fits in the border, of course, you just go to set some markers. You clear the ones from before if they're confusing, and you use the sew head to check that you have enough width in the border. So I'm setting down some markers to check that the quilt is not totally distorted. I'll only set 4 because I want to just check the width. I'll join them up by clicking around them. There we go. That's okay. There's the blue box showing me where the border is. I zoom in, or maybe even a bit more. I can see that they do fit within my border area, so that's good. So I might as well stitch that section. So go to sew options, DQ all, select that bit, green check, play, start point. Qmatic has now stitched out that next section over here on the left. So I've moved the sew head over onto the last stitches that it did on this vertical border, and I want to match up the next piece, and I think it should be this one. So I shall go into actual sized view, and I shall pull the tail right on top of the crosshairs. Okay, I'll go back into full view, and then I can use markers to check that I've put that in the right place. Let's clear the ones we had, and let's set some new markers. Just checking that I have adequate width. So I'll connect them up. Okay. I shall zoom in to check that it does fit within the blue box. And then just to doubly make sure, I might just check this meeting point again. So I'll take the sew head to the last bit of stitching that it did before. So the sew head is in the correct place. Let's go into actual size view. Well, it wasn't quite accurate, so I'll just shift it over a smidge. That's better. Full view. Still fits within the blue box, that's great. So options, DQ all. Select the piece that you want to stitch. Green check, play, start point. Qmatic has neatly stitched that right-hand section of leafy border. Okay, now I need to get some more of these springs done. So I'll take the sew head over and I'll place it on the last stitches of the springy border that's already been stitched. The crosshairs of the sew head are placed exactly where the last springs got stitched. So now I need to line up the next springy vertical piece, which I think will be this one. Now I can obviously fit several in before I hit my safe area, so I'm going to connect a few together. So I'm going to connect up the next section of springy border. One thing to look at is where the start-stop points are. They look to me like they're in the wrong place because when I set them up as a design, I must have gone all the way around the quilt like this. So I'm just going to reverse some of them. So they start where they can join on nicely. Right, it looks like we can fit a few of them together. So let's connect them, attach. I can fit that many, which is good. So we'll say yes to that. Now I'm going to go and put some markers down to check that I have sufficient width in my border. I'm going to join them up. Okay, so that's where they're allowed to go. Of course, what I forgot to do was position them. So let's just put the sew head back onto the very last stitches of the previous springy section. Right, put the sew head back. Then I shall use actual sized view to line them up. So the sew head is in exactly the right spot. So these springs need to move. Let's have a look to see if they fit in the box, and they do have sufficient width. So I'm going to go to sew options, DQ all, and select that bit to sew next. Qmatic has sewn out the left-hand vertical section of the springy border. Now, just to point out that you don't always have to do things in the exact same order, this time I'm going to set some markers down for my right hand springy border, and then I'm going to position the springs. So let's go to the pin, clear the previous markers, and I'm going to use my sew head just to check that I have enough width in the border of my quilt for these springs to go. So I've just put a few down. I'm going to connect them together. As you can see, the design from the screen really doesn't fit beautifully in the box, but there's nothing to be alarmed about because it can be moved. So we'll just say, yes, the box is okay there. Then I'm going to take the sew head and put it right on top of the last stitches of the springy section here. So the crosshairs are indicating exactly where the next parts of the spring should join on. So I'll need to click the next piece of spring, which is that one. And I need to join up the other ones. I may find that I need to reverse the starts and stops like I did before. It would help if I zoomed in for a closer look. Right, let's see if we can connect them together. And that looks as though it's enough before we start getting close to the safe area. So we'll say yes. Right. Let's just check the positioning. So the sew head is on top of the stitches of the last bit of spring that was stitched. We go into actual size view. I can move the red spring so its end tail is right on the crosshairs there. Let's get a zoomed out view. And it does still fit within the border area. So it's going to fit within the border area and it's also going to join on nicely. In which case we'll go to sew options, we'll DQ all, we'll select just that bit, green, play, start. Qmatic has now stitched out that right hand section, vertical section of the springy border. Next thing to do is to see which pieces of shell border we can fit in. I'll just highlight the corner to see where we got to. So we've done that part already, so that's worth noting because this side comes down further than this side. So positioning could be confusing. You just need to know where you are. So I'm going to take the sew head across and I'm going to position it on one end of these petal points. So I've taken the sew head across to the top end of the petal point. I'll see if that's correct in a minute. I'm going to click the first piece that I want to join on. Now that is too much. It comes out of the safe area, so we need to disconnect it and then just reconnect what we can fit in. We will be able to fit in 3 vertical sections of this shell border. So I'm going to see that if I can click 3 of these vertical shell sections together. I hope I've got the start stop points in the right place, otherwise they'll attach weirdly. And 3 is ample, otherwise we're outside of the safe area. The sew head is bang on top of the last stitched line. So if I go into actual sized view, wasn't entirely happy with the positioning. So I've taken the sew head to the bottom end of the petal. And I'm going to go into actual sized view to check and see where that is. So the sew head is indicating the bottom of the petal, not where it is on screen. The sew head crosshairs are what we're lining up with. So I'll just line that up there. Come out into full view. Select the part that I want to sew. Green check, play, start. Okay, so Qmatic has stitched out the left hand shell border. So now we have to do the right hand one. So I'm going to take the sew head and put it right on top of the previous stitches of the section that is already sewn. We'll go for the bottom end and see if that's a good place to line up. And then we need to work out which sections of the right hand shell border we have to do. Remember, we did the top border and the corner came down as far as there. So the next piece to connect on will be this one, and this one also will fit. So let's see if we can attach them together. Hopefully the start-stop points are the right way around for us to attach them nicely. If not, we'll move them. That's good. Right. Now then, we can see that the crosshairs are down here, but we need to line the pattern up with that bit. So I'm actually going to shift the sew head so that it's at the other end of that petal shape. So I have moved the sew head so that it's sitting right on top of the previous part of the design. If we go into an actual sized view, we'll see. There we are. So the red part needs to come down and go there. Try not to get alarmed by the fact that it doesn't match up on screen. We're matching up on the quilt. So it goes there. Okay, full view. Now, I said before, we don't always have to place markers. We can, it's an option. As far as I'm concerned, I have matched up my starting point, but if we want to check that it fits nicely still, we can certainly put markers down. So we'll clear the old ones and we'll use the sew head to just check. So if I connect them up, my border hopefully will fit within that, the width of that box. It does look quite close here. So let's just double check where it's going to join on. So I'm going to take the sew head back. The sew head is where it should be at the previous stitching point of the section that's been sewn. If we go into actual sized view. So now I have a bit of a dilemma. I either have a very nice joining point or I have a design that encroaches into the next border. So I have to have a think about that. One solution could be to go into resize. And I can see that the design is currently 4.75 across the way, 12 point something down the way. So I could possibly experiment with changing the sizes. To do that, I need to uncheck maintain ratio. I need to make a note of what these sizes are so that I can go back to them if I want to. So let's just have a go at reducing this by 1/4 of an inch. So I'll use the keypad and I'll go down to 4.5. Okay, apply. Right, green check. Well, that does actually solve my problem. It is now within the blue box. So I need to make a note somewhere that I changed it. If I've forgotten already, I can go quickly back to resize. I've changed it to 4.5 by 12.09. I only changed this measurement, but I need to know that for later, and I need to know what it was originally. All right, let's go with that. And now I just move it back on top of the crosshairs. I think that's the best solution. Full view. We'll go to sew options. We'll do Q all. We'll select the piece we want to do. Green. Start. So Qmatic has finished stitching the left-hand vertical shell border section that we were working on. And it looks great. It's joined on nicely and it hasn't encroached into the springy border. One thing though, it's a little bit further away from the inner medallion than the opposite side, but visually it looks good. So that's a compromise I'm prepared to make. Okay, now within the safe area, we will be able to do these two medallion sections next. So it's well worth checking your bobbin levels and just to check that there's no fluff in the bobbin area. So we'll do that first. Okay, so I've checked my bobbin level and I have defluffed the bobbin area because that's generally where you get tension problems, is by just overlooking tiny pieces of fluff. Right, I have clicked the central medallion on screen, and as you can see, it's all connected, all 4 sections. So I'll only be able to fit 2 sections within my safe area, so I'm going to have to disconnect them. And then I really want to join that one to that one. So I'm going to click the first one and I'm going to connect it back up to the second one, like that. So we're going to be working on a rectangular section of the medallion middle part. So that's okay. Now, I think I'm going to not use markers this time, but I'm going to set a boundary because I want the corners of the design to go right up into the corners of where I've marked it on my quilt. And in boundary, you're allowed 4 corners and it will morph it to fit into the shape that you've got. So I will go into boundary and I will be using the sew head and I'm going to morph to fit. So I'm going to take the sew head into 1, 2, 3, 4 corners. And you can see that a box has been drawn, and that is where I need the design to fit. I could have chosen to leave a margin. Sometimes it might be a 1/4 inch or even a 1/2 inch margin, but I want it to go right into the corners. So I'm going to give it a green check and it has shifted it just slightly in order to fit within where I set that boundary on the quilt. So that's the bit I want to sew next. So I go to sew options, DQ all, and select that part. Green, play, start. Okay, Qmatic has now stitched out approximately half of the whole cloth quilt. So you could stop there for the day and go back to it, or you could keep going. One thing that I forgot to remind you about was that you should be saving frequently as you go along, especially if you're going to go away and do something else, possibly shut the system down, possibly even unzip it and put on another project. So let's just have a quick save. File, save, project. Check that it's the copy that you're saving because that's the one you're working on. Save. Replace it, yes, because it's updated. And at this point, we could go away and then come back later.